and we are on chapter 5 and 6. So we're going to start with Sherri, followed by Maritza, Rob, Joia, and Rupali. Sherri, take it away.
Okay. So since Shrikant is not going to start with his own little tidbit here, I want to make sure that we bring in what he mentioned the first time we met on this book, and that what happens in the first chapter of this book is Louis Sullivan's talking about the outside breaking in and the inside breaking out. We've gotten to a little bit older age here, and that means there's a lot of stuff starting to really happen with this young child. And I'm saving several good things for others, and I wanted to bring up a couple of very specific things. I always want to mention to everybody, remember that he talks about his father in a fairly negative way, although the father is also, we hear, the one who is joining him on his explorations of big scenic hikes and love of the outdoors. So there's part of that up until now, we're not really sure where this negativity to his father comes in. We start getting that in here. And it clearly is to do with a couple of an educational element, but also a disciplinary element. That's important for us to keep in mind as part of that outside breaking in. But the one thing that I want to really mention in this section here is we're seeing this element in Sullivan of really loving to see what men can create, what they can build. Remember, from his earliest age, from this very first chapter, we hear that here is the child who is not bent on destruction. It's something that he at that early age sees himself as different from the other kids, that he's not bent on destruction. He's very much on the creation. And we're seeing through these two chapters, especially this fifth chapter, this growing love of what men can create, what they can build, what they can do. We see that when, despite the frigid morning swims with his father, we see his description of his admiring his father's powerful swimming stroke, and what he can physically do with his body. But I want to talk about the bridge. So can we share screen?
Yeah.
I'm going to let you do that part. And while he's pulling that up, you've got the picture.
Yeah, there it is.
So he talks about discovering when he gets to, what's the name of the town here? Newburyport. I keep trying to do Newport Berry, which doesn't work out. Newburyport. So he has seen rivers before, but he's never seen a large river. And he's never seen a bridge. I'm sure he's probably seen a small bridge. And then he comes across this bridge. And this is the first, this is something that you don't hear about in this book, but I think all of us should be aware of. This is the first chain link suspension bridge in the United States. And so it's pretty important that he's discovering this. And what I really want us all to get in the mindset of being a young child who has never seen a suspension bridge before, because before this, they didn't exist. So it's hard for us, having seen the Brooklyn Bridge, having seen suspension bridges in almost every city in town, some pretty spectacular bridges of all different kinds of construction techniques. box girders and arches and so many different varieties of spectacular bridges. It's hard to bring us to this sense of what it was like to come across this while walking by himself in the woods. But let's give it a try. So here we are, it's on page 82, when Louis Sullivan comes across this in the woods, hiking off away from his parents by himself. Meanwhile, something large, something dark was approaching unperceived, something ominous, something sinister that silently aroused him to a sense of its presence. He became aware. He peered through the foliage. What was it? He could not quite see. He could not make it out, except that it was huge, long, and dark. He thought of turning back, for he was a little boy alone in the woods, bordering a dark running river whose power had stilled him. Remember, he's never seen a river of this kind of a power. The Merrimack River was one of the first rivers. They had started with the smaller rivers, but they eventually worked up to using the Merrimack River for its power source as in textile industries, which was a very huge industry in this area at this time. So these bridges would bring you to the other side where you could harness the power of these deep running gorges and rivers. This is something new, completely new. Imagine being a young child and coming across in the woods this roaring, deep, dark river. And all you had seen before that was little rivulets. And then this bridge. He was high strung with awe. He could glimpse the river. He was moving forward unthinkingly, even while he thought of turning back. The dark thing came ever nearer, nearer in the stillness, became broader, looming, and then it changed itself into full view, an enormous, terrifying mass that overhung the broad river from bank to bank. He saw great iron chains hanging in the air. How could iron chains hang in the air? He thought of Julia's fairy tales and what giants did. Might there be a fairy in the woods nearby? And then he saw a long, flat thing under the chains. And this thing too seemed to float in the air. And then he saw two great stone towers taller than the trees. Could these be giants? Could these be the giants? And then all of a sudden, mystery of mysteries, he saw a troll, probably a farmer, not much bigger than a man, come out of the fairy forest driving a fairy team. The troll went right across on the flat thing that floated in the air and vanished. This must be the land of enchantment that Julia talked about. And then, of course, his father finds him and sees that he is completely terrified of what he has imagined. And his father calmly tells him, yeah, we're not going to listen to Julia's Irish stories any longer. And then, and this is another one of those instances where his discussion of his father turns into a very positive sense. And his father says, now we will go to the bridge and see it all. What is a bridge, Papa? That is what you're to see. Don't be afraid. It won't hurt you. So they went to the nearby bridge. And then the father continues here. He explained that the roadway of the bridge was just like any other roadway, only it was held up over the river by big iron chains. That the big iron chains did not float in the air, but they were held up by the stone towers over the top of which they passed. and anchored firmly into the ground at each end beyond the towers. That the roadbed was hung to the chains so it would not fall into the river. That the bridge was so strong that many people and loaded teams could pass over it at the same time. And as he said this, happily, some teams and people came and went. So gradually, he brought his son out of nightmare land into the daylight of reality. For fearful shame, he substituted in his son's heart confidence and courage. Thus was the child mind freed again to wonder what men could do. And he adjusted himself to the greater world in which it had been suddenly catapulted from South Reading's tiny world. Within that little spot of earth, he had never seen a river, never a bridge, for neither river nor bridge were there to be seen. On their way to rejoin Mama, the child turned backward to gaze in awe and love upon the great suspension bridge. There again it hung in the air, beautiful in power. The sweep of the chains, so lovely, the roadway barely touching the banks. And to think it was made by men. How great must men be, how wonderful, how powerful, that they could make such a bridge. And again, he worshiped the worker. He then goes on into descriptions of shipyards and some other fantastic descriptions of these, what he now coins, we can unshare the bridge, what he now admits as his idols. These are two other pictures of the bridge. There we go.
Sherri, let me ask a question.
Yeah.
I love the way in which he recounts major events in his development. So here, there are two things. One is the matter of discipline, that kind of just sheer physical discipline and kind of getting your body to do whatever you want it to do, and you have to train it. And it's hard and it's arduous. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is this reality-oriented, he already has this reverence for nature.
Mm-hmm.
He has kind of the romanticism, but putting in this layer of just reality, the connection with reality, which his father does. And I think he describes it really well. I mean, it's very clear that that's a leap forward.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that he has this kind of mixed feeling for his dad. It's clear that he really appreciates the reality orientedness. He also appreciates the training in some way of what that you can do this with your body, but at the same time is, it's difficult, I'm sure. So what do you think of that particular stage?
I think there's a situation there where, and we see it in the next chapter actually, when he talks about another incident with his father, where his father starts teaching him something, but then teaches him from a higher level, too high really of a level. And Sullivan talks about it's almost erasing that child awe and wonder. And I think that is most likely the thorn that digs the deepest. I mean, there's this discipline issue that we hear about, but I think that's it. That's the thing that digs deepest for Louis Sullivan, that dissolves his relationship with his father, and I think it's because it could have been so wonderful.
I want to contrast his relationship with his father with his relationship with his grandfather.
Yes.
There is a beautiful description of the grandfather kind of watching the son, watching his grandson very intently, paying very careful attention, but being very gentle.
Yes. Yes. And the father and the grandfather knows, and we hear this in earlier chapters. There's a line, I'm not going to be able to find it right away, but there's a line where the grandfather knows not to interfere too much with a child that is developing. And the opposite, the father is very much trying to input. Oh, Rob's found it for me. Grandpa did not bother about the child's education for being wise. He knew the child was daily self-acquiring an education exactly suited to his temperament and years. So the father is much more concerned. He has that reaction at the bridge, and then the father says, "Oh, we have to. He's too excitable. We need to calm him down." And I don't know if this is part of, I mean, there is that sense in this time period in the US that if you're Irish, you're hot-headed, and maybe there was part of that culturally going around, that was part of what the father was trying to tampen down, but really it causes that serious rift between the two.
There is also, I mean, there is the root of this in both the men, both the grandfather and the father. Father says, you have to make it in the world. So you have to do whatever is needed to make it in the world. So that is a big thing for him, as how you should be. Whereas grandfather's take is that most people are idiots. You have to figure out what's your right attitude towards nature and everything is. That's far more important than being on the good graces of everybody around you. Something like that. So I think that colors the way in which they deal with it.
And also remember, his father, if I'm remembering this correctly, his father was lost from his own father off in the woods, and then essentially, I like age 12, made his own way in the world from age 12. And how you'd go from at that age to becoming a dance instructor instead of somebody laboring in the shipyards is pretty interesting. You can tell there's this sense of musicality and arts and beauty that's very much in his father's soul, but an uncomfortableness of letting his son just explore like that. He just, I don't know if it's that the father is just so stuck in you've got to make it in the world, or if it's just, the grandfather is another generation removed and as more years and more wise, understands how these things work, has seen it before, because of course this is the father's one and only son, so it's that first time out for him. But there's this rift developing. At the same time, there is this great joy, the fact that his father can carefully explain the structure of a bridge to him, so it's no longer frightening, terrifying giants, but that it's this beautiful thing that men made that span across the river and that has never been done before. That is hugely impactful for this young child.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yep. So then we go on. There's a couple. We get on many other examples, and I'll leave these for others. Of Sullivan talking about his idols. This becomes a big theme from here on. We will see it over and over. Then we get into the 6th chapter where he's now in Boston. And I think this is always a very funny thing to discuss, because I know we have city folk and country folk together here. And I find this really a fascinating thing. for as much as I love a city, I have trouble living there long term. It's a little too agitating for who I am. And on the flip side, when Shrikant comes to visit us, the first time he stood in the backyard and just wandered around kind of in aimless circles. And we all stood in the house drinking our coffee saying, what is he doing? And he was just wandering about in an aimless way in the backyard. They came in and then said, everything out here is your land. And I said, yes, everything that you can see up into the woods is our property. And that whole concept was so strange to Shrikant. So these parts here I like to add in because they make me laugh to do this for Shrikant. So we get here Sullivan in Boston, and the big city, much bigger, full of bridges, full of buildings. And let me find my quote here. The city. He's talking about the mildew. Oh my gosh, yes. Okay, so here's one of my favorite parts here. In those about him already city poisoned, even in his own kin, he found no solace and ceased openly to lament. Against the big city, his heart swelled in impatient, impotent rebellion. Its many streets, its crooked streets, its filthy streets, lined with stupid houses crowded together, shoulder to shoulder like selfish hogs upon the trough-like lanes, irritated him, suffocated him. The crowds of people in wagons hurrying here and there so aimlessly as it appeared to him, confused and overwhelmed him, arousing amazement, nausea, and dismay. So in the corner, I have it listed here as hog houses. The row houses of Boston, they're not hog houses, but I just love the description. Now, from a child who has spent all of his time in the country, wandering about, you can't do that in Boston. And imagine this is horse-drawn carriage time. So, and people warming themselves with coal. So it would have been smoggy and smoky and horse manure everywhere. It would not have smelled nice. It's not like Boston is today. It's really quite clean. It may be a lot more people honking horns now, but it's the air you can breathe, where did you put this? Okay, so, but then he gets into this thing about the powers. You can see there's this fascination in the city too. He began indeed to sense the city as a power unknown to him before, a power new risen above his horizon, a power that extended the range and amplified the content of his own child dream of power, as it had seen manifested in the wide open within the splendid rhythm of the march of the seasons. And he talks here as though men had made the city when they were mad, and that as it grew under their hands, it had mastered and confined them. So you can see that early in those ages, he's reacting to the buildings around. And I think this is hilarious how he describes it as the city was made by the men when they were mad, when they were angry, and then the buildings themselves confined them, which I think you can see the sense of an early architect responding. He's seen the reaction of the built environment on the people who built it. And then I'm going to wrap it up here unless Shrikant's got something else. There's so much more in here. But let me finish we're getting to this ending part. While Shrikant brought up this issue with the father, right at the very end of this chapter, we get to one of these instances where Sullivan describes it as his father's joke, where they had gone to see this piece of scenery. They had climbed up high on a hill, one of the highest hills they had reached before. And then the father talks about perspective. Which hill, which of these two hills is the bigger hill? And instead of letting the child get to that realization himself, he made it a joke and toyed with his son and told him, knowing that in the child's mind, the bigger hill would be the bigger hill. But instead of saying, oh, well, let's go climb this one, let's go climb that one, and then ponder the difference, he instead put on his child the difference. This joke he talks about, thus had a father's playful joke set up in the child raging fermentation. So he's reacting to being told. And this is really funny also when you think about it, having read all of kindergarten chats. He's reacting at that young age to being told what the answer is instead of being allowed to discover it for himself. And I think that is the crux of what really bothers him about his father.
And you can see the contrast between that and his discovering about the moon.
Yes, yes, exactly. That's a perfect example of the two. And if any of you have ever raised any Montessori kids, trust me, the idea of helping them with something or telling them something, you will get an earful. You're not allowed to do that. And they become very belligerent on their own behalf that you're not allowed to do that to them. So I think these are two really great chapters that really start opening up that new level. And I'm sure Rupali is going to be talking. I'm hoping Rupali is going to talk about this. We're at this age group. He's coming into a new plane of development as a child, and that's a big part of what we're seeing in these two chapters.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherri. And I love the way in which all of you say, okay, you know what Rupali is going to be talking about? Oh, Maritza is going to be talking about the tree. You know, of course, Joia is going to be talking about all this poetry stuff. Love that. Next up is going to be Maritza.
So I'm going to start backwards, actually. Chapter 6 to me was kind of, so I read chapter 5 and it was almost like more lighthearted and enjoyable. And then you read chapter 6 and I felt like it was like the opposite. I found myself unprepared. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. That's not fair. You didn't prep me for this chapter. I felt like chapter 5 was just full of all the wonder and the exploration of the child. And then in chapter 6, we see the beginnings of the loss of that. And even in the very beginning of the chapters, Sullivan takes he does a sidebar commentary with those of us, his readers, right? And what's interesting, what he's saying there to me is it's like reality, right? He's kind of defining for us the doom and gloom, as it were, of our day to day. And there are a couple of things that are striking to me. He talks about, different ways in which we view like a dream state and dreamers in our society and for ourselves personally. And, he says, I really like where he says, we do not associate the idea of dream with our strenuous hours of thought and deed in the self-same broad daylight. And he says this in response to how wondrous we view dreams when we're, dreaming at night. Then he says, nor do we see the stars at noon, but they are there. And so is a dream there within every human ever, day and night, unceasingly. And that's so striking because every one of us can think of at least one person that we know has forgotten that. And I would garner every one of us at some time forgets that. We probably forget it perpetually throughout an average day. And so that brings us to the question, well, why does it matter that we forget that, stars are always there, even when you can't see them? Because of this child that we've been getting a glance into. I see Sullivan telling us that the path here, the goal is an adult with a sense of wonder intact, an adult with a creativity intact, and the strength of character to wield both appropriately to the circumstances in which he finds himself. And so that's why I did find, chapter 6 to be far more like just impactful to me. But I was also very, very struck by the scenario that Sherri and Shrikant were just talking about, where we were.
Maritza, can I ask you about the first? It's amazing observation. I want to connect it to the other series that we did on Romantic Manifesto. Ayn Rand calls herself a romantic realist, and she's talking about art. But that's what Sullivan is.
Right.
The human being. He's saying that that's what a human being is. He has the romantic and he has the realism, and you have both.
Shrikant, that's the funny thing of what you were saying about the contrast between the grandfather and the father, is that one has one, the other has the other. Sullivan benefited from taking the best aspects of both and merging them into his own reality. And I think that he would really agree with that definition that she has.
And I just want a side point about that. I mean, even the way in which Sullivan interacts with things that he does not like is very interesting.
Yes.
It impacts him. He's very clear about the impact of it, but it goes only so deep. It affects him, but it affects him only so much. And then he does something
Right.
against it.
And I think that it's that Sullivan makes sure to describe those scenarios for us, because I think that without those, we can't truly understand the wonder with which he's looking at a train conductor. Like, you have to have both. And that's actually something that I do see here. He introduces us in the beginning of chapter 6 to this concept of exceptions and rejections. I don't know if he uses that exact word, those exact words. I think he literally does use those exact words. And he says rejections and acceptances. And to me, it felt like those there begin a theme that's going to come throughout. I see those two words tied directly into the statement that Shrikant introduced us to at the very first chapter, and that Sherri brought up to us again today when we're talking about, breaking in and breaking out. We can say that succinctly by saying, rejections and acceptances. And we, with this commentary on dream or the stars, it's also a cautious admonition to those of us who are now adults, that even if you are not aware, these rejections and acceptances are still happening to you. And they're shaped by those things that have come before. So if we remain aware, we can hopefully wield more control over it. But I think that gets me into a slight tangent, right? But so I want to talk about the father's joke. I know Sherri touched upon it, but I really do think that it is such a pivotal moment for this child, that what we're seeing, that it just bears a more in-depth thought. And so I'll go at it from my perspective. And so, why not start with the trees? As I can just picture this young child just like sitting down and like his brain exploding, right? And he's like wondering about mystery and questioning some of the things that he's observed in his short life and how he's observed them. And it's almost heartbreaking to follow his thought process, because he says, did this mystery reside also in his lovely, slender elm tree? Was his great friend, the ash tree, involved in mystery? Now, from a child's perspective, mystery is a negative, right? So it's like maybe that day that you realize that your imaginary friend was imaginary. And you can just almost feel that you can almost feel that pivot. And then it gets even sadder, because then he says, must he lose his faith in what seemed real? And, my brain wants to reject the idea that, mystery means we have to lose our faith in what seems real. But I suppose there is an element of truth to that, but it's okay, because this young child goes on to do something so many of us can't. We'd get stuck in this. We'd get stuck here. Like, oh my God, is everything I thought real? Just not. And I'm going to sit here and I can't move. He keeps questioning and he spirals a little more, wondering what's not real. And if things are understood, it may take away the wonder of it all. And then he says, but wait, could this mystery be penetrated? And then miraculously, he's like, he was determined it should be sooner or late, and that he would do it. Well, crap. So this kid's already smarter than me several decades later. Imagine to be able to make that determination so quickly on the heels of a perspective altering event. I don't know about you guys, but I don't pivot that quickly. And it's kind of really impressive to see that written in black and white. It really is. And to imagine that at the beginning of chapter 6, what Sullivan is telling us is that we, the adults who are the bringers up of children, bear a large responsibility and witness to these types of pivots. And I don't have children, but it really does make one, it's another one of those sit still and contemplate moments that is just deeper than when you read it the first time. And I feel like every time I read it, it kind of etches itself a little bit more in my brain and in my soul, because it really, if one ties it to where one finds oneself, it can really be an emotional journey into how we view the world and our rigidity towards changing perspectives. And that's kind of how I view it here. And it's, I will say that I ended chapter 6 with a little bit of sadness for this boy who finished chapter 6 different than he finished chapter 5. But I don't think it's for the worse. Hopefully, right? Well, we know how the story ends, so I guess not. So there's quotes and other things here, but I just think that those were the things that I wanted to point out and what I thought folks might want to consider. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maritza. That was amazing. Next up is Rob.
Hi there.
Scoot over.
Yeah. All right. So there were a couple things. There was something else. I'm going to talk about one thing, and then this whole thing about perspective and mystery, this perspective story, which I think I want to say something about that. But first, chapter 5, the big thing that struck me is I talked before about how in the previous chapters, how much he reflects sort of an enlightenment perspective, the idea that nature is the standard and everything, school and religion all have to be judged by the standard of what is nature telling me. And if they're not measuring up to that standard, then to heck with them. And he liberates himself from both. But in this one, it also strikes me to the extent to which he was deeply influenced by the Industrial Revolution. Because you have this, especially in chapter 5 here, it's all about the railroad and the bridge, right? And these were all incredibly new things at the time. And that's what we don't quite realize reading it from our perspective, where this is old technology, right? From our perspective, but in his perspective, this is probably 1860s, early 1860s. So the railroads had really only been operating for 20, 30, 40 years at the most. And this suspension bridge was built 1820, 1830, something like that.
Well, it depends on which.
Well, you had a whole history.
Yeah.
She looked up a whole history of the bridge. There was an early version built in the 18th century, but the one with the chain suspension bridge was only like 20 years old or so at the time he comes across it. So, there's this whole massive world of construction and of engineering marvels being built all around him, such as railroads and such as suspension bridges. That is all really totally new and radical at the time. And so it's interesting to see the enthusiasm that this creates for him in his mind, and the awe that he has of it, and how deeply that influences him. But I want to get into this thing about, and so I would notice that on one more thing to say about that, which is that we've talked before about how a lot of the stuff that's in Louis Sullivan in kindergarten chats in here clearly influenced Ayn Rand in writing The Fountainhead. What struck me in this chapter 5 is how much it probably may have influenced her in writing Atlas Shrugged. Mm-hmm. This idea of there's a quote, I don't have it with me, in Atlas Shrugged about the Taggart children and Francisco de Anconia going around and exploring all these marvels, engineering marvels and things, and this moment where a professor of literature comes by and says, a young man in your position should be in libraries, absorbing the culture of the world. And they're in a junkyard with an old car, and he says, well, what do you think I'm doing? This is part of the culture of the world, is all these machines. That one struck me, by the way. My youngest son just recently discovered in the lean-to behind our shop, left behind by the previous owners and totally forgotten. I did no idea what it was. He suddenly realized it's a hand crank forge. So it has this crank that you do that, and it has a fan inside, and it blows air in a pipe. Basically, it has the bellows to feed a forge for forging metal. He discovered that, got extremely excited, took the whole thing apart and got me how to help a little bit, took the whole thing apart, fixed it up. And now he's saying, oh, we have to get coal and we have to get an anvil. He wants to start making stuff. So it really struck me as that sort of same exploration of, well, here's this piece of rusty old metal I found back there, and I discovered it's a machine, it's a machine, and I can rebuild the machine and I can make it work. That same kind of excitement. So that's basically what's going on with Sullivan in chapter 5. But let me talk a little bit about this perspective and mystery. This lesson in perspective and the sense of mystery. So I say perspective and mystery because I'm looking at the page, and those are the words that are in all caps on here. Mm-hmm. So he has a lesson on perspective, and it leads to this sense of mystery. Now, putting aside the editorializing about his father, who he clearly has a very mixed feelings about, but the raging fermentation that's set up here as this sense of mystery. And this is a mystery that lay behind appearances and within appearances and in front of appearances. A mystery which, if penetrated, might explain and clarify all, as his father had explained and clarify a little. And then, let's see. And he talks about this mysterious perspective that lay behind appearances, that lay behind even the clear apparition his father called perspective. Must he lose faith in what seemed real? Was Boston itself and all within it but a mask and a lie? Was there within it and behind it a perspective, a mystery, which if understood might reveal and clarify it, making it intelligible? Now here's what I find fascinating about this is sort of, I'd encountered this in philosophy, that there's sort of a double-edged sword in philosophy. That philosophy tries to, that there's the promise of discovering a clearer and better explanation behind things. But there's also, especially in the history of philosophy, the temptation to interpret that as you're discovering that there's a hidden reality behind the reality you think you see. And the reality you think you see is an illusion, and there's a hidden reality behind it. And the symbol of this historically in philosophy is the philosophy of Plato, right? Because he starts from, Socrates had come along and basically said, we have to question everything. We have to question, if you have this concept of justice, we have to ask, well, what is justice? And we have to ask all these series of questions and have a whole dialogue about what is justice in order to figure out, does your initial concept of it make any sense? Does the conventional view of it make any sense? And we'll penetrate to the reality behind it. That's what Socrates starts when he establishes the field of philosophy. Now, the problem with Plato, and it's not just with Plato, but with other early Greek philosophers, one of the things you start to see is this idea that having asked questions and done this further analysis and come up with new concepts and new ideas, there starts to come up this idea that in coming up with the new logical implications of these questions, that we've somehow exposed the reality of what we see as fake and as not really real, and that there's a different reality behind it. And in Plato, this is the metaphor of the cave. That the reality we see around us is like these shadows playing on the cave wall, and they're not really real. And when we engage in philosophy, we're discovering the real reality beneath that, and see that what we see with our senses is just an illusion. And then there's a realm of pure forms that achieved through reasoning that is the real truth. And so I sort of describe this as the inception problems. For those who've seen the movie Inception, there's that sort of idea that what if everything around you is a dream or a lie or is a false reality. And that's sort of you can see how he's having a problem with that, how he's struggling with that dilemma, because he uses two different kinds of words here. On the one hand, maybe this hidden reality, the mystery lay behind appearances within appearances, might explain and clarify all, right? So you're not saying reality isn't real. You're just saying that it can be explained and clarified in it from a whole new perspective at a different level. But on the other hand, he's also struggling with that everything's an apparition, that he has to lose faith in what seemed real, and that everything you see is but a mask and a lie. So he's struggling with those two possibilities. As you gain that increased knowledge of the world, as you penetrate it on a deeper intellectual level, on the one hand, maybe that will explain and clarify. So you're not wiping out what you think is real, you're understanding it on a deeper or fuller level. On the other hand, the idea of what if it's all a lie and an illusion? So he's sort of he's almost reaching adolescence here, and he's starting to get that deeper perspective on reality and struggling with the two ways that could go. And that's what I see as being the raging fermentation going on in his mind in this story.
So that's really fascinating. So I want to make one comment. If you look at his, Louis Sullivan's way of going about, he is like, as he was describing in his earlier chapters, to anybody else, he would say, this is a little guy who likes to work. Yeah. That's the starting point. He's doing things. This relates to the meetup we had yesterday on Ascent of Man, which talks about the hand. that it's the hand that shapes the brain. It's the loop between the hand and the brain. That is what creates the skill and ascent of man. That view is dramatically opposite to the Platonic view, where its Platonic view is that of people watching TV passively, trying to figure out what is going on. So firstly, it is passive.
Yes.
It is, you're taking in something. And then, once you do that, then, all hell can break loose, because what does it matter what you come up with? Whereas he's very much of an Aristotelian. I don't like to call him Aristotelian because Aristotelian was too Platonic. But he is the one of the participants yesterday saying that his comment was very beautiful. He says, we call human beings Homo sapiens. We should call them handymen. Handy. It's so the distinction, instead of wise, should be handy, because that's really the essence of what human being is, and that's what he has as a base. So, that's the distinction I wanted to make.
Okay, and I, this has been this really struck a chord with me because it's in my mind. I've been thinking of writing a piece about. It's something about the way philosophers tend to think about things is that when they describe, philosophers talk about the problem of induction, or the problem of this and the problem of that. And I there's always been something that sort of grated me the wrong way about the way they talk about that. And I realized what it was, which is that properly speaking, the problem of something like induction, let's say the problem of induction, because this is one where it really comes up a lot. The problem of induction is not whether induction exists. It's not whether people can draw rationalization or generalizations from observation, because they do. The whole world around you is proof that they do. The problem is how does it work? How do we explain it? But oftentimes the way the problem of is taken of, especially in academic philosophy, is that the problem of is to decide whether or not it actually exists, right? And if we can't come up with an explanation for how it happens, then therefore it must not exist. So it's like the explanation has to come first, and without our explanation, the reality of the thing can't exist. Rather than the reality of the thing comes first, and then that is what produces our explanation.
Right.
And
it also relates to Sullivan's way of thinking. A problem contains its own solution. So you keep trying to do things. You try to climb the wheel. All the hills, and you try to transform as much as you can. And if there is a problem that you come up with, you're going to find the solution within the problem itself. And what this is doing is that, again, it's kind of partly, it is almost like a social kind of power play or something like that, saying, oh, I know something. And you're actually using that knowledge in a very destructive way. You're actually stopping somebody's conceptualization, ability of conceptualization by concept that somebody else developed, that you just took, and you're trying to destroy the ability of people to conceptualize. All right, thank you. Next up is going to be Joia.
Thank you. I love that Rob talked about Atlas Shrugged, because I'm going to want to talk about the Fountainhead today, but that's not until chapter 6. And so first we're going to start with chapter 5. And I love how Maritza pointed out how chapter 6 really takes us to a sudden dark turn that we don't even anticipate or expect until we get there. But chapter 5 is still this wonderfully bright chapter where we see young Louis Sullivan full of such wonder and exploration, and 3 main values that I think even tie into this broad idea we'd been talking about, how reality breaks in and out, that quote that we had that we keep repeating from our first session with this book. And with that, there were 3 topics here that I really wanted to dwell on and explore. One, the idea of what Sherri called the mighty men and their work. 2, the idea of words and the power of words. And then 3, the new world of what he calls pure knowledge. So the mighty men and their work, the words, and knowledge. And so first starting with the men and their work, and I absolutely love the way this chapter starts, where we see Louis Sullivan just like that prototypical 4-year-old. He's a little older than that in this chapter, but that's the age that I always think of when you're just constantly asking why. As he says, he began at once at the very beginning of the beginning, that intolerable, interminable series of questions which all children ask. And it's significant that what we see, that what he's really interested in, all his why questions are about all the work that these men do. Why did the wires move up and down all the time? What were the wires for? Why did the poles whiz by? What did telegraph mean? What made that funny noise all the time? Click-a-lick, click-a-lick, and so on and so on. He was amazed at what the brakeman knew. It was wonderful how much he knew. How wonderful that one man could be so strong as to stop a car that had been going so fast. Wasn't it splendid to see a man in action? And then the importance too of having to go out and see it for himself. He wants to go and ask the brakeman all these questions, why, but he's not content to just ask. He has to go out and actually see these things, see how it works for himself. True, the brakeman had told him all about it, but that wasn't seeing. And besides, he wished to know the engineer and the fireman personally, for they must be great men. It must be a wonderful man who could keep the engine on the track and steer it around all those curves, as the brakeman said he did. And so just more of this, of the power of the mighty men. We see this even and I think some of the other panelists have been pointing out this chapter, we really see how he has this kind of dual perspective on the father. There's what he values and then what he disdains in the father. And we've clearly been talking about what he disdains, the way the father trickily plays with this joke of perspective and such. That's the father to the bad. But the father to the good is the way the father is this exemplar of the mighty man. And there was just some of this that I'll just say, as a woman reading about men, I love this part of the chapter, and I just have to read this out loud. He says, he had never seen a man completely stripped and was pleased and vastly proud to have such a father, especially when the father, an object lesson in view, made exhibition dives and swam this way and that way in lithe mastery. And he asked his father to promise him he would teach him how to do these things, that he too might become a great swimmer. For he had a new ideal now, an ideal upsprung in a morning's hour, a vision of a company of naked, mighty men with power to do splendid things with their bodies. So just this idea of the men, the power that emanates from their bodies, and then we're going to see also from their minds and how he's growing. And he says how big the world was growing, how fast the world was spreading, so that as Louis Sullivan is awaking to the power of the men and what the men do and what the men create, the world too is also spreading, his understanding of what is there. This is even in his impression of taking in everything in Newburyport. It's the first time we see he's realizing how, when he was just in South Reading, how limited his view was. When he was there, he didn't realize it was a whole world unto itself for him. But now that he comes to Newburyport and he realizes there's all these things, like Sherri talked about the bridge and there's the river. Like I love the way he even phrases it, where when he talks about how he first sees the river, the child had never seen a river. Was it not wonderful, this river, so wide, so dark, so silent, so swift in its flow? How could such things be? Why had he not known? Just even that phrase of what it's like to encounter the river and to realize that the world is growing. And he has a phrase about this too that I love, where he's there when he's looking at the great river Merrimack, lost in the thought that the world about him was growing so large that it seemed out of proportion to him, too great for his little size, too bewildering for his untutored mind. And then we're going to get into the long passage that Sherri read so beautifully, where he encounters the bridge for the first time and is scared because he thinks it's this awful troll out of a fairy tale. But even this idea of too bewildering for his untutored mind, like after reading the kindergarten chats, it struck me that this really gets into the power of what a real education is. And I'm sure here I'm going to pass it over to Rupali because she's going to be the one who I know is going to have so much to say about that. But here we even see his glimmer of the education that he knows he needs, that it's because the world does have this level of chaos because he doesn't yet have the knowledge, the skills to be able to deal with this new vast world that's opening up in front of him. Let me see. So then there was more here to say about the mighty men. Just some beautiful passages here, like this line where he says, the child turned backward when he sees the bridge and he finally understands what it is. The child turned backward to gaze in awe and love upon the great suspension bridge. There again, it hung in air, beautiful in power. The sweep of the chains so lovely, the roadway barely touching the banks, and to think it was made by men. How great must men be, how wonderful, how powerful that they could make such a bridge. And again, he worshiped the worker. And then there's even more where he's gonna encounter the shipyards. And now we're also gonna get into the second theme that I wanted to talk about, which was the power of words. And here again, I think we're starting to see, this to me really even captures the duality of the father. Because on the one hand, we see the father can be good with words, that there's a way, as he puts it here, father was clever in making simple explanations of things he knew something about. This expertness came of his long training in teaching little tots to dance. His skill and patience in this respect were fine art. So gradually he brought his son out of nightmare land into the daylight of reality. So we see that when the father has something that he actually does understand, he does have this incredible skill to present that to the child. And that's something that is of great value to Louis Sullivan. But then there's this other thing that's going to happen with words when it's a subject that the father does not understand so well. And we're going to see that he uses words in a different way. But first, we're just even going to see as he awakens to the power of the words. And I think it's significant, too, that the awakening to the words comes in combination with the work the men are doing. So even just to connect this, as Shrikant was saying, with what we were talking about in yesterday's Ascent of Man and the importance of the hand, like what Phil was who called being a handy man, that this is what a human being is. And it seems really significant to his view that it starts with these men who are men of their hands, and that it's from that he even gets his views about the value of words and the ways in which words can be powerful when it builds on the work of the mighty men. So he says here, in the shipyard were crowds of men working, doing many things, all moving at the same time, all urging toward a great end. The child was in a seventh heaven. Here were his beloved, strong men, his workers, his idols. What a great world it was into which he had been thrust. The great river, the wonderful bridge, the harbor, the full rigged ship so gallantly moving. And what new words too. Circulation, calisthenics, catenary, dietary, suspension bridge, and others that seemed very long, very strange indeed. Was he also entering a world of words? Were there many more such words? And to tie this back to this idea of the breaking in from without and out from within, as he's entering these new worlds, that here we have the world of words. And again, just to stress how important it is for him that the world of words comes out of the world of the work, comes out of the world of the mighty men, what they're doing with their hands, what they're making. And then from that is the power and the world of the words that's opening before him.
The Latin for handyman would be homo manibus.
Homo manibus, I like it. But then, and then I want to get to this point where we see the distinction with the father and what the father is going to do with words. But it starts even again where Louis Sullivan is still just enamored with his homo manibus. What's the plural in Latin? That's what you got to tell me. What are the mighty men? But here we say, what could men do? Oh, sorry. What could men not do if they could do this? And if they could make a great bridge suspended in the air over the Merrimack? He poured forth his questions, and Papa answered them pretty well, but a bit pedantically, where he was not posted. He used too many big words. He concealed with them what he did not know. And that, I think, is the big distinction, where we're seeing now the world of words when it's not tightly connected to that world of work. But when the father doesn't really know, and he's not able to give simple explanations, not able to tie it back to the powerful world that Louis sees, but instead it's just these big words that, as he says, that the father uses to conceal what he does not know, the big words. But then I have to talk about this next passage, because we learn a new word for Louis, which is one of my favorite words, which is when he learns the word poetry. But just to read this. A few days later, father and son saw the launching of a ship, and the child had another spasm of wonder, for the ship seemed to him to launch itself. He did not see any men pushing it. And father recited something about, she seems to feel the thrill of life along her keel, which he said was poetry because it all rhymed. So the child learned at once what poetry was. It was a new word. And again came the regular questionnaire, and again father did his best, using, however, so many strange long words that the child became drugged and drowsy with them and said he wanted to go home. So they, both father and son, went home. And again, it was striking to me that when he learned this word poetry, which we know for Louis Sullivan is going to be such an important word, from everyone who is here with the kindergarten chats, that he even sees poetry and architecture, that to be a poet for him is so essential to what it is to be a good man, to be a good human being. But yet how when he first learns that word and enters into the world of poetry, it comes more from the negative side of the father. So there's something to be learned here. But then after we've had this negative view of the father, we flip back even to, again, the good side of the father. So I wanted to read this part as well. When the child teases to be taken to Plum Island. And he points out, so at South Reading, there was only a railroad and 2 ponds, a big pond and a little pond and some hills. But in Plum Island, there's the ocean, right? And we learned the son, accompanied by the father, went to Plum Island, for he had said, "This is to be mine, isn't it, Papa?" And the father had relaxed at the idea. So there, I think, again, we see even the good side of the father, that when the son has this insistence that he needs to see Plum Island, he needs to see the ocean, he needs to see this expansive world that's opening up to him, and he needs to see it because this is to be mine, isn't it, Papa? That's what encourages the father to take him to see that. And there again, that's the good side of the father then coming out again. And then, after all this with the mighty men and the words, the chapter closes with the revelation of this new world of knowledge, which comes even as when they finally go and they're looking out at the ocean and they're looking at the horizon. We get the idea of undertow, another word, and more explanations. And then Louis Sullivan, again, we see the ever observant Louis Sullivan watching the ships go off across the horizon and then suddenly panicking because to him it looks like the ships are sinking. And so then this experience, what happens? He starts crying, "Papa, some of the ships are sinking. One is all gone, but to the top of the masts, one is just beginning to sink." Father, who wished to educate his son, now found his work cut out for him. How to explain the curvature of the sea, how to explain the horizon, how to prove that the ships were not sinking. He went at it bravely, patiently, doggedly, step by step. He even made diagrams on his drawing pad. And that even seemed to me to be really significant for who we know Louis Sullivan turns out to be, and maybe something good about this father, that when the father has to explain something really difficult, like the horizon and what's happening with the ships, that part of his way of going about this, he's not just concealing ideas that he doesn't understand and big words that he doesn't know. He pulls out a drawing pad and he's going to draw it as that way to get the son to understand what's going on. And then we have here, little by little, the child grasped the idea. He brightened with intelligence. His father had opened up for him then and there a new and utterly unsuspected world, the world of pure knowledge, vaster than the sea, vaster than the sky. And for the child, the portal to that limitless world was an illusion, the sinking ship. So that's how we end chapter 5. And then we get this turn in chapter 6. And from a literary perspective, it was interesting to me even how this chapter gets narrated. This would be, in the movie, we started the movie off with old Louis Sullivan going to tell you his life story. And now we've probably had a good, half an hour or so that's all about the young children. And that's what we're seeing. And now we're going to cut to another scene of the old Louis Sullivan again, coming back from that old man perspective to narrate to us what's going on here as he's looking back. And I found this to be especially important because we're even going to get his explanation as to why he's gone into such detail about his childhood and the importance of that and the significance of that. And it has to do with this idea of dreams, the child dream. And so in this chapter, I had these two big ideas that I really wanted to talk about, this idea of the child dream and the idea of accepting and rejecting, both of which even Maritza already started to talk to us about so beautifully. So talking about the dream, we kind of get to it in this circuitous way where we're talking about memory, and then we're talking about the kinds of dreams that we have when we're asleep, but then we're going to the other meaning of dream, that is the dream that is aspiration, the dream that is ambition. And as we point out here, and Marissa was talking about the dream, our broad daylight dreams, the dreams that happen not at night, but the dreams that were happening when we are wide awake. And what he says here that I wanted to read, and why this is so important, that what the dreamers do. So Louis Sullivan says here, we impeach the dream idea, calling certain men, quote, dreamers. We do this in derision, much as the pot might call the kettle black. We do not suspect that we could not put one foot forth before the other, were we not dreaming. So artificial and sophisticated are we in our practical moments. And it is even so as we forget that each of us was once a child, even as we banish the thought, as crude as that, out of that very child, we have grown inevitably to be what we are. The thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, the reactions, the waking dreams of that child have governed and determined us willy-nilly through the course of our lives and careers with compelling power, that what the child accepted, we accept, that what the child rejected, we reject. And then going on here, for it is the child in multiple series that creates the flowing environment of thought and deed that shall continuously mature in its due time. It is the moving child in multiple of long ago that created for us the basic environment within which we now live. And this is the idea, I've heard it expressed as the child is the father of the man, that he's really pointing out to us here, that who we are as adults is determined by who this child was as a dreamer, what that child's dreams were, their ambitions, their vision, that aspiration. And significantly, this idea of what the child accepted and what the child rejected. And the importance of this, of the accepting and the rejecting. And just to say it here, right? Hence the unceasing flood of child personalities, accepting or rejecting, influences an environment, historically and in mass, victims of fate rather than masters of destiny. For destiny and fate alike have birth in what is accepted or rejected by the child. And then he's going to tell us, with this digression as a commentary, we may now resume in its natural course the story of a growing child well known to us and proceed to extend that series of rejections and acceptances, beginning in his infancy, into an ever enlarging world of fact and fiction, until we may perchance obtain a glimpse of what they really were and their significance in determining his onward drift, a drift that has yet developed with no self-defined momentum. So just to get back to this idea of the child that's going to create the adult in what they accept and what they reject. And this is what when I read this, it immediately makes me think of one of my absolutely favorite quotes of all time from The Fountainhead. And I have so many favorite quotes in The Fountainhead, admittedly, as probably everyone who is here for the Romantic Manifesto probably knows. But one of my all-time favorites is this quote from Howard Rourke, which I think ties in so perfectly well with what Louis Sullivan is talking about here. So my quote from The Fountainhead, Howard Rourke says, "What you feel in the presence of a thing you admire is just one word, yes. The affirmation, the acceptance, the sign of admittance. And that yes is more than an answer to one thing. It's a kind of amen to life, to the earth that holds this thing, to the thought that created it, to yourself for being able to see it. But the ability to say yes or no is the essence of all ownership. It's your ownership of your own ego, your soul, if you wish. Your soul has a single basic function, the act of valuing. Yes or no. I wish or I do not wish. You can't say yes without saying I. There's no affirmation without the one who affirms. In this sense, everything to which you grant your love is yours." And so Ayn Rand's focus here really is on the idea of the I, that other quote from The Fountainhead, in order to say I love you, one must first be able to say the I. This is her focus really is on the I. And I think that totally connects to what we've already seen with Louis Sullivan. And for example, even just what we saw with Plum Island, where this is to be his, because he's going to say yes, he's going to accept that, and he's going to give it his love, and therefore it is going to become his. But I think Louis Sullivan and Ayn Rand are really echoing each other here with this idea of the importance of the act of valuing. I mean, Ayn Rand goes out to say this is, the single basic function, of what's going on in your soul, your consciousness, the act of valuing. And what that is saying yes or no, I wish or I do not wish, or as Louis Sullivan is going to say, acceptance or rejection. And that's so important to reflect upon, I think, even as we're looking back, and to see from what we already saw, what did he say yes to? What did he say no to? And he's pointing out to us here to pay attention to this as we keep going on, to pay attention to what he's going to accept and what he's going to reject. We see this here. It's going to come up. One quote here that I just have to read because I think it's so important, even connecting this again with the idea of the dream and what the child dreams. We have this beautiful passage of when he's doing the work with his grandpa, and I think maybe he's probably going to say more about this, but I wanted to read the end of what comes at this section where Louis Sullivan says, the desire someday to exercise such power to the full became in him a definitive dream, within which, unnoticed, was resident the glow of a deeper power, a power that had suffused a swiftly moving vocal springtime, which he had seen and heard and lived in this same spot. And this is when he's back in South Reading. So this is in the spot where he had that childhood experience of nature. And I'm going to cheat a bit as someone who's read the book before and draw your attention to this idea of this definitive dream that had started as a child. We're going to see this phrase come up again and again about the child dream of power, the child's dream of power. So I just want to point that out as like, here's that first little seed of it, and so that you pay attention to it as we encounter it. It's going to come up again and again. And what that means, this idea of the child's dream of power, that its connection to those first childhood experiences out in nature with the power of nature, and the child's experiences of the mighty men and their power, and now growing within himself, this recognition of this own power and the power that, his determination to exercise his own power someday as an adult. And I just wanted to end by connecting this to the ending of the sequence about perspective, which I think all the other panelists have now talked about so beautifully. But to me, the most significant part about this whole passage is the way it ends, and connecting this again with the idea of the dream and with the idea of acceptance and rejection. So, we got to the end, and, even Rob read for us here. I'm just going to read a little part of this again. Was there within it, behind it, a perspective, a mystery, which, if understood, might reveal and clarify it, making it intelligible? Could this mystery be penetrated? He was determined it should be, soon or late, and that he would do it. Thus had a father's playful joke set up in a child a raging fermentation. Such high-pitched emotion could not last. Such vision was bound to fade. Such fear must pass. And so it happened. The turmoil, the chaos lasted but the span of a daydream. But within that dream, within that turmoil, there awakened a deeper dream that has not passed. Thus, Louis Sullivan accepted and rejected, rejected and accepted. And I think this is so important to me. This is what's underlined as the most important point, I think, where we're at with his growth here. We've seen that he's accepted that wonder with the world of visible things. And then he's going to have this experience with the father where he's going to get this realization that, he's got to go beyond that to the things that are underneath what's just there in the visible world. And at first he's going to reject it. And then, but from going from rejection to come back to acceptance. And the acceptance is this dream that has not passed even to the old man, Louis Sullivan, writing this dream that is going to have that determination to penetrate those mysteries. And we are going to see exactly what mysteries he is going to penetrate next.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joia. Joia, I have a correction. It is Homo habilis.
Habilis.
Now, unfortunately, that name is already taken, but I think it was given to an ancestor of Homo erectus, and that should be taken back. And we should use it for human beings, which has a side advantage because it solves the problem that Rob is talking about. You can ask Plato, "Are you handy?" He says he's not going to say yes. He's going to say no. Okay, you're not a man. whatever you're trying to do is not the characteristically human. Mm-hmm. Okay, Sherri has a point, and then to Rupali. Sherri.
Yeah, and I apologize, everyone. This was in my plan to talk about earlier, but Shrikant's question got me off on a different track, and what Maritza and Joia have mentioned reminded me that this is something, one little snippet I wanted to put in, which is part of when I'm reading this, I'm looking for those little kernels that show us the beginnings of who Louis Sullivan was as an architect. And that description of the bridge, remember, it's this wonder that happens when the structure becomes clear in his mind. That's a massively important thing. And I think that we see that in all of Sullivan's architecture. And we also, from all of Kindergarten Chats and all of what we've read in this book so far, the importance of nature is so clear to all of us. That makes so much sense that is part of Sullivan's architecture. But one of the things that comes up in the description of the bridge is his stories that he hears from Julia, from the housemaid, the Irish housemaid. And if maybe it's not something you have looked into, but a lot of Sullivan's ornamentation on his buildings is very Celtic, has a very strong Irish bend to it, if you could accept that term. And I'm wondering, because we keep hearing the importance of Julia and Julia's stories and these intertwining stories, if part of Sullivan's Irishness in his ornamentation is really coming from that seed of Julia. So I just wanted to throw that out there for all of you to think about as we continue reading.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sherri. Next up is Rupali.
Thank you. It's very interesting that I was going to say I have 3 points, 3 values to talk about, and Joia had a very similar structure. So I like it. It's wonderful. The 3 values that I'm going to talk about is very similar to what everyone's talked about before. One is the importance of parental involvement in education. And chapter 5 talks about how his mother and father were involved. And then we also know about his grandparents' involvement and what that means in early childhood education, especially. The second value I want to talk about is that of mighty men. We've all talked about that, and the value of work. I'm also going to talk about that with regards to how Montessori views the value of work and the child's work. And then the value of dreaming. For Louis Sullivan, dreaming consciously and dreaming so that it shapes our lives. Last time when we were talking, Shrikant, you made an observation that, I'm talking from an educator's perspective, but how do we take these lessons and make them our own in our adult life? So I'm going to try and aim at that a little bit, but
let me recap that, because Rob and Sherri had left at that point. Okay. So the point I was making is that I really like what Rupali has done with this entire series, both kindergarten chats, and because she has applied it to education. But I think if you look at it just as a lesson for education of your kids or how we should deal with education, that's a cop-out. Because what really you need to take is that you need to understand that and realize that you are actually the child. Like, what do you need to do to keep growing throughout your life like that at its highest? That's what the aim of it. So that was the point. Go ahead, Rupali.
Great, thank you. So, Joia mentioned this before, that Louis Sullivan talks extensively about his childhood. And in this chapter, in chapter 6, he explains why he does so. And although Joia has read this, I'm going to read this part again because it is relevant to me as a parent, as an educator, as an individual, and the importance of dreaming. So he says, and it is even so as we forget that each of us was once a child, even as we banish the thought as crude, that out of that very child we've grown inevitably to be what we are, that the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, the reactions, the waking dreams of that child have governed and determined us willy-nilly through the course of our lives and careers with compelling power. That what the child accepted, we accept. That what the child rejected, we reject. Thus, from the abysm of memory's stillness, that child comes into being within life's dream, within the dream of eternal time and space. And in him, we behold what we were and still are. This is a memory mirror that we may rediscover ourselves. Deny him, we dare not. But theirs is the new one. Now theirs is the child. So for the child, their dominion is a new one. Ours, the old, and as ancients, we move on unchanged from the children that we were, leaving our thoughts and deeds as beaten trail behind us. With this image in the view, the narrator has laid extended stress upon the authentic study of the child. And so the childhood experiences that he talks about, and that the children look at things with wonder, and we perhaps have squelched that wonder as we've gotten older, and we do the repeated, the things that we do because of our experiences as adults. So to recognize that spirit in the child, to kind of say every child is a spiritual being. That's what Maria Montessori talks about, and Louis Sullivan talks about the spirit in the mystical spirit in every child. And so he says, beneath the overlay of the child was a mystic, and he's talking about himself, inarticulate, wondering, believing. These fleeting revelations of life came and went as interludes with the chosen practicalities of his realistic and material activity. And so life to Louis Sullivan comes through these hands-on, this real experiences, the real world experiences. And when the children work through these experiences, they're making connections between the physical world around them and the ideas, the abstract ideas that construct the world. So these experiences become very important to the development. So when it comes to our own children, how should we be educating them, knowing that this is how children work? This is that the spirit exists in each of us. So, he talks about his father, and we've seen how in some cases his father was a very good educator, and in some cases where he didn't really understand the child, he failed. I'll share a story very similar to what Louis Sullivan talks about. In a Montessori classroom, the work is laid out for the child, and the child takes the materials and builds things to then discover the underlying principles. And often you see that this work takes a long time and multiple trials for a child to figure out what the underlying idea is. A trained Montessori teacher will stand back and observe, much like the grandpa. But a new teacher or an assistant who may not be trained jumps in very quickly. So we had this 6-year-old boy who was working on the puzzle of the world from Pangea to today, and was really fascinated and was trying to fit in the pieces and was getting frustrated because some pieces just would not fit. And the assistant, she has, all of us have this motherly instinct or adult instinct that let me do it for you. And so she jumped in and put the pieces together. And the child just looked up and started to cry. He was just so devastated. It was his work. Something was going on in his mind. He was imagining things in his own way. And here an adult who thought was helping him just came and destroyed that whole experience for him. And he was sobbing and sobbing for a long time because he could never go back and do it for himself. And as adults, Maritza, you asked the question that, you mentioned that although you're not a parent, we are all adults with children around us. And how do we engage with children and to kind of allow them to do the work, to slow down. There's no rush, that let them discover it for themselves through the work of their own hand. That hand to brain connection, again, is so important in learning about how these abstract ideas are formed through concrete experiences. So when I read about Louis Sullivan's experience about the hills and how he was crushed, it just reminded me of this particular child who had a very similar experience.
Can I say something, Rupali?
Sure.
So that one, there are many ways of thinking about it. And one is that it is saying what is really valuable is conceptualization, not what the product is, not what the child produces right now, but that ability to conceptualize. What It doesn't matter what the hand produces. It is that cycle between hand and brain going back and forth. That is what the ultimate thing that is being created, because that is the process of the child. It's not, so it's that process which is the focus. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Louis Sullivan says, but Louis, instead of receiving this information from his father with acclaim and joy as a new world opening before him, he was deeply saddened and perturbed. The father was no psychologist. He had indeed but little human sympathy or insight. Hence, he had no suspicion what was going on beneath the surface of his own son. And so, I think as adults, we can just be a little more sensitive to what the child is doing and the child is thinking. Now, Rob had kind of highlighted on this that the idea of what's real and what is unreal for a child, what is real, what is a lie. The whole idea that the world is not just black and white. So I'm going to look at it from a child's perspective. I'll just share a diagram that, let me see, okay. So Sherri brought this up earlier. She talked about the planes of development that Maria Montessori talks about. And Maria Montessori talks about life, as a rhythm that goes from infancy to adulthood. So she divides the period from 0 to 6 years to the age of 25. I mean, from 0 to 25 into 4 parts, that stage of infancy, childhood, adolescence, and maturity. So what is happening in the infancy stage? We see, in the first 2 chapters, how Louis Sullivan talks about his first 2-3 years of life, and he's just absorbing and soaking all the information that's around him. As the child grows, now here in these chapters, Louis Sullivan is, one foot in his childhood stage, and the other still in his infancy. So he's going from what is concrete, what he is learning about himself, and then into this new world that is opening up for him. So in the ages of 7 to 12, that's the time when the child starts to figure out how things work. They start developing the idea that there are abstract ideas, but they get that idea from actually engaging with concrete work. They also start figuring out how they fit in within the social structure, their relationship to others in the society. And this is a very, very sensitive age for imagination. They can imagine at a much, much higher level than they can read or write or do their math. And so to be able to imagine, and you can see this in Louis Sullivan's work, that he can really imagine things at a great level, but then they don't have the skills to articulate that yet. But those are the experiences that are going to shape them later in life. So, when we share ideas with children, and Louis Sullivan talks about his grandpa, about how his grandpa only gives some crumbs of knowledge. He doesn't go ahead and give the whole explanation. He even says, when his father went into this whole explanation of these big words with poetry, he kind of got really bored and said, can we just go home? And often you see that in education, you see that same thing. My niece would always say, my teacher does all these big presentations and I just fall asleep because there's nothing engaging there. Whereas when a child can actually see for himself or herself, they can then figure out the shades of different things that are within what is and what can be for the child. So it takes time, but the ages 7 to 12 years is when that is happening, that is developing in the child's mind. So that's the part about education. And the in Montessori classrooms, you see the focus on the work of the child, and all children are engaged in doing physical work, and children love to carry big things. They love to plan new things. They love to come up with great ideas and say, what if we start this club? And so there's all the social activity. So from there, I'd like to go to the idea of mighty men, because this is the age when children need to have the ideas of these mighty men. They need to have role models. They need to, and so you see in Louis Sullivan, when he sees his father ready to swim, that is like, okay, I am inspired by this. I can do something like this. And so to have role models for children, whether we can be role models, and that has been a very difficult thing for me in my personal development, is, to be a role model for my son. I've had to make many changes to say, okay, I'm very, very consciously saying, is this right? Is this what I want to do? And is this how I'd like to see? Then you think about yourself as an educator. And Maria Montessori talks about the educator as the role model for the children, and how their appearance, how they conduct themselves, how they talk to each other, all of that becomes part of role modeling as adults. When I read this part, and pretty much everybody has read the description of the bridge, I just wrote Ayn Rand, and then I had all notes about Hank Reardon and Frisco, D'Anconia, Dagny. I mean, take any one of those characters and you can see, how great men must be, how wonderful, how powerful, that they could make such a bridge. And again, he worshiped the worker. So I think everybody's talked about it, so I'm not going to spend too much time about that, but to just help children see those role models in real life, and give them the opportunity to be in their shoes. So we have something called Mystery History Day, which we've talked about before. I know Sherri's son also has something similar at their school. But to be able to read a biography or an autobiography, and to be in the shoes of that character, and to actually be in character and speak in to your classmates, it's just a phenomenal experience for them, and they can then start forming these ideals. In fact, our teachers will remember who their mystery history character was, and when children come across challenges, they'll say, how do you think Mr. Hershey would have approached that? And so it takes everything off of the child's, personal level, and then they think about the problem at a much higher level. So having mighty men, mighty women in your life is really important. It actually brings me to a memory from my own life. During our summer vacations, my father would take us on a road trip from Pune to Bombay. It's not a very long journey, but when we would drive, there was a factory called Alpha Level, and it occupied a large frontage. The frontage occupied a large mileage of the highway, and it was beautifully landscaped. And there was this huge factory behind that landscaped area. And as we would drive, my father would say, this is a factory that is run by a woman. And back then, she was one of the first women CEOs of a factory in India. And I've never seen her, never met this woman, but I had this imagination about this mighty woman taking control and managing all these people under her. And I was like, okay, that's what I want to be when I grow up. And, so as children, we always have those images or those dreams about the mighty men and mighty women in our lives. So let me see. Yeah. I'm just going to collect my thoughts about the dream again. So when a child is inspired and a child is thinking about who they want to be or what they want to be, that knowing, from Louis Sullivan's work, that's really what shapes them and consciously is shaping who they're going to become. So to allow for that imagination, to allow for that work to take shape and be a reality is important in the classroom. So whether you teach them literature or poetry, dance, building, whether they're doing some research on neural networks, I mean, whatever the topic is, whatever they may be inspired by, children can actually start making their dreams a reality by doing projects. So if the education system is not where one size fits all, Louis Sullivan talks about his school experience where it's dull and the knowledge is coming to him very sporadically. Whereas when he goes out in the world with his father, he can see the big picture. He can see all men working individually and then creating something together with individual efforts. So by giving children those experiences, instead of squelching their dreams, we can actually help them at a very young age make those dreams a reality, whether it's through their science projects or the poetry that they write. But I feel that, sometimes we just think, oh, that's a childish dream, and we shut that off. So I want to go back to kindergarten chats where Louis Sullivan talks about the powers of math. And he says, I nurse the dreamer of dreams, for in him nature broods while the race slumbers. So would I teach the art of dreaming as I would teach the science of thinking, as I would teach the value of action? He who knows not of dreaming can likewise never attain the heights of power and possibility in persuading the mind to act. For vapor must arise in the air before the rain can fall. He who dreams not creates not. The greatest man of action is he who is the greatest and a lifelong dreamer. For in him, the dreamer is fortified against destruction by a far-seeing eye, a virile mind, a strong will, and a robust courage. So the power of dreaming is very, very important. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Rupali. That was great. All right, folks, if you have any comments, let's see. Mike or Evanik, any thoughts? Give me just a second. I want to make sure you can unmute. Hold on. Yes, Mike, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I was writing the whole meetup, and I wouldn't know where to begin in terms of my feedback, but I'll just mention one that I went to a pretty strict Catholic school from kindergarten through 9th grade, yet I felt like I had a Montessori education on the street because the age group that I'm in, being born in '62, so I was walking to kindergarten by myself. There was absolutely no adult intervention. So we learned how to build things, how to get into trouble, how to dig holes, how to throw rocks and I grew on a street that had chestnut trees. We were the only street in the area that had them. So we got really good at throwing chestnuts, making beads and necklaces with them. So listening to you all talk, and I made so many observations, I'll just leave it to this one, that it was interesting in my mind how I connected a pretty rigid classroom style from being in a Catholic school, which also had its benefits in terms of learning discipline and being kind of strict with my studies, but yet it felt like, especially when Rupali was presenting, that it was a Montessori education on the street with no adult intervention. It was just a very interesting dynamic. Thank you all very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Evanik.
Yeah, first of all, thank you to all the presenters. You guys did a wonderful job really bringing it to life and really focusing on how I think in the beginning where you guys were talking about the suspension bridge and how new that was for him, for Louis Sullivan, like really bringing that to life. I think something you said, Sherri, that really spoke to me was when you were talking about if you're using this book or this chapter as an excuse just to say this is for children, then you're cheating yourself. It's not. Like, I think sometimes we lose that as adults because we're being practical. And you can see that with Louis Sullivan's father, I think, because Louis Sullivan's father was being practical. And I think a lot of parents are practical. Like Michael, I also grew up with a Catholic education, grade school and high school. And, you know, the whole purpose is to get a job. And it's from well-meaning parents, you know, so it really is about well-meaning parents. But I think we lose that sense of discovery and discovering on our own certain things. Especially in today's society where you can just Google an answer. You don't even have to think about it. You can just be like, oh, okay, I can just go to Google the answer, and I got it. And I think the sense of discovery and even finding different solutions, like we just kind of Google the solution and we're done. And in some cases, it's practical if you don't want to go deeper. But I think what this does and what Louis Sullivan does in this whole throughout the whole all of the chapters is he discovers things. And it's not like he stops. He never stops discovering. And I think even his architecture, he never stops discovering. I think that's the main point. And I think everybody had a different way of saying that because they pulled different things out of it. Even if the discovery isn't the most pleasant thing in the world, it's still the discovery. So thank you to everyone that, you know, spoke today. It was really good discussion.
Wonderful. I want to say that the best phrase for this that I've heard is Pronowski's phrase of longest childhood, of saying that is what really characterizes human beings, that if you can remain like that, growing throughout your life. Anybody, any of the panelists want to make any kind of closing thoughts?
I would just like to kind of piggyback on what Michael and Evanik said about, the balance between discipline and structured teaching and then being out on the streets and learning for yourself. I think between the father and the grandfather, Louis Sullivan got that. And, his father was right in some ways when especially he wanted to teach his son about the horizon and, how the ship sank. And so he says, father who wished to educate his son found himself new work cut out for him. He went at it bravely, patiently, doggedly, step by step. Little by little, the child grasped the idea. He brightened with intelligence. His father had opened for him there and then a new and utterly unsuspected world, the world of pure knowledge. So the thing is, at some point, having a parent, having an adult who can teach you, who can be disciplined about, let's do this every single day. I mean, I can tell you one experience with our students from India, right? I bring them up because it's when we started, the parents didn't see any results. And they just saw the children laughing and playing. And they were like, oh, what are they even learning? They're just making skits and whatever. But now those children can actually think for themselves. They can work for themselves and they can figure out things back. But it was every single day. Like that transformation happens over time. So you do need that discipline. You do need that rigor. And then you have the grandpa, on the other hand, who understands, grandpa did not bother about the child's education for being wise. He knew that the child was daily self-acquiring an education exactly suited to his temperament and years. And so to allow the child to just be in Montessori, she talks about, these long uninterrupted periods where the child can take their own time to figure out things and not to just rush them from one activity to another, but give them time, because it's when you have that time in between the structured time periods that those connections actually happen.
Maritza.
I just want to say it really quickly, but Rupali just said, I just had last week, I think, a discussion on whether or not adults were too old to learn the language. And that position was one that I was trying to make to folks, the concept that, you're talking about a child's structure that would make it best for them to learn and grow, but it's not just a formula for children. For us too, we need the discipline. Now, the discipline for us as adults is going to be more self-imposed, perhaps, but it's the matter of discipline and habit, and that coming back every day is what's going to get us to learning and continued learning. And I said before, and I'll say it again, that I believe that that is the key to youth. If we continue learning, that's the way that we stay young. And I think it's through what Rupali just described for us. I think that methodology works just as well for adults.
Wonderful. Joia?
So I just wanted to point out this is a comment too about this idea of discipline, and it's kind of a teaser from someone who knows what's coming next. But we have this one line that's going to give us this little hint. We hear here that Louis, looking ever aimlessly, yearning for a teacher. As a rose springs upward from the muck and puts forth gracious blooming, even so, out of the muck of the school, a reaction sprang up, a fervent, hungered yearning within for a kindred spirit to arise that might illumine him and in whom he might rejoice, a spirit utterly human that would break down the dam made within him by sanctioned suppressions and routine, that there might pour out of him the gathered cesspool and the waters of his life again flow on. So we see here that Louis Sullivan has not yet found a teacher, but even the young Louis Sullivan recognizes he needs a teacher because he's being aimless. And so we're going to see, from someone who's read the book, we're going to find out that Louis Sullivan eventually does find some teachers, and we're going to see exactly what those teachers think about discipline.
Wonderful. I like the preview and the teaser. Wonderful. Next up is going to be Rob and Sherri.
I don't really have much more to add, and I think we should probably start leading because we're stretching Sherri's endurance.
Yes.
No, I think Joia did the perfect job of ending with that perfect teaser. And by the way, notice once again, Louis Sullivan's talking about rose bushes.
Wonderful. All right, folks, this is delightful. See you next Saturday. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Hi, thank you.
Bye.
Bye, guys.